speaking on it, but before he comes up here, we're going to watch a Bible Project video on it. So please join us as we watch that video.
The Book of Lamentations. It's a unique book in the Old Testament that contains 5 poems from an anonymous author who survived and is now reflecting back on the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem and the destruction and the exile that followed. Remember the whole story from the book of 2 Kings. The fall of Jerusalem and the exile was the most horrendous catastrophe in Israel's history up to this point. So remember, God had promised Abraham the land. He'd given David victory to make Jerusalem Israel's capital. And from David came the royal line of kings. You had God's presence there in the temple, and that's where the priests maintained the rituals of Israel's worship. And after 500 years of all of this history, in the summer of 587 BC, the city fell to Babylon. It was all decimated and gone. And so the Book of Lamentations is a memorial to the pain and confusion of the Israelites that followed this destruction. Now, the lament poems found here are not unique in the Bible. There's lots of them in the book of Psalms. And these biblical poems of lament, they do a number of things. They're a form of protest. They're a way of drawing everybody's attention, including God's attention, to the horrible things that happen in this world that should not be tolerated. They're a way of processing emotion. So in these poems, God's people vent their anger and dismay at the ruin caused by people's sin and selfishness. And these poems are a place to voice confusion. Suffering makes us ask questions about God's character and promises, and none of this is looked down on in the Bible. Just the opposite. These poems of lament give a sacred dignity to human suffering. And so these human words of grief that are addressed to God have now become part of God's word to his people. The design of these 5 poems is very intentional. It's part of the book's message. So chapters 1 through 4 are called acrostics, which means alphabet poems. Each poetic verse begins with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is made up of 22 letters. Now, this very ordered and linear structure, it's in stark contrast to the disorder of the pain and the confused grief that's explored in these poems. So it's like Israel's suffering is explored A to Z and is trying to express something that is inexpressible. Chapters 1 and 2 each have 1 verse per letter, giving them a really similar design, but the themes are very different. So chapter 1 focuses on the grief and shame of a figure called Lady Zion. The poet personifies the city of Jerusalem as a widow, also called the daughter of Zion. And she sits alone. She's bereaved of her loved ones, devastated. No one comes to comfort her. It's a very powerful metaphor. And then Lady Zion speaks. She calls on the Lord to notice her fate. And through this image, the poet, he's showing that the city's destruction brought a level of psychological trauma on the Israelites that can only be expressed as the experience of a funeral and the death of a loved one. Chapter 2 focuses on the fall of Jerusalem and how it was a consequence of Israel's sin and was brought about by God's wrath, which is a key word in this poem. Now, it's important to remember that in the Bible, God's wrath is not spontaneous, volatile anger. The biblical poets and prophets, they use this word to talk about God's justice. So Israel had entered a covenant agreement with God, and for centuries they've been violating it by worshiping other gods, perpetrating injustice, oppressing the poor. And so, yes, God is slow to anger, but he eventually does get angry at human evil, and he will bring his just anger in the form of punishment. In the case of Jerusalem, this involved allowing Babylon to come and conquer the city. And so this poem is acknowledging that God's wrath is justified, but this doesn't keep the poet from lamenting and asking God to show compassion once again. Chapter 3 breaks this design pattern by having 3 verses per letter, so it's the longest poem in the book. And the voice is that of a lonely man speaking out of his suffering and grief as a representative of the whole people. And what's interesting is that this chapter is full of language that's drawn from other parts of the Old Testament, from the laments of Job and from other important lament psalms, and even from the suffering servant poems in Isaiah. And the poet sees his hardship as a form of God's justice, like chapter 2 said. But paradoxically, this is what gives the poet hope. And it leads him to offer the only hopeful words in the whole book. Because of the Lord's covenant faithfulness, we do not perish. His mercies never fail. They're new every morning. How great is your faithfulness, O God. So I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will put my hope in him. So the poet reasons, if God is consistent enough to bring his justice on human evil, then he'll also be consistent with his covenant promise to not allow evil to get the final word. And so for this poet, God's judgment is the seedbed of hope for the future. Chapter 4 goes back to the same alphabet structure as chapters 1 and 2, and is a vivid and disturbing depiction of the 2-year siege in Jerusalem. And it contrasts how things used to be in Jerusalem of the past and how terrible they became in the siege. So children used to laugh and play in the streets, but now they beg for food. The wealthy used to eat lavish meals, but now they eat whatever they can find in the dirt. And the royal leaders used to be full of splendor, but now they're famished and dirty and unrecognizable. And the anointed king from the line of David has been captured and dragged away. So the poem's power comes from the shock of these contrasts, and it's exploring the depth of the suffering that Israel brought on itself. Now, the final poem is unique because it breaks the design pattern. It's the same length as all of the other alphabet poems, but the alphabet order is gone. It's like the poet can't hold it together anymore, and his grief has exploded back into chaos. The poem is a communal prayer for God's mercy. Israel begs God not to ignore their suffering or abandon them. And the poem offers a long list of all of the different kinds of people who were devastated by the fall of the city. They ask God not to forget these people, and they lament on behalf of others, giving voice to their pain. Suffering in silence is just not a virtue in this book. God's people are not asked to deny their emotions, but voice their protest, to vent their feelings and pour it all out before God. The book ends with something of a paradox. The poet acknowledges that God is the eternal king of the world, but also that Israel's circumstances make them feel like God is nowhere to be found. And so the final words of the book leave this tension totally unresolved. It asks, unless you've totally rejected us, and the book ends. The poet doesn't offer a nice, neat conclusion, much like our own experiences of pain and suffering. The story of the Bible doesn't end here, but this very important book shows us how lament and prayer and grief are a crucial part of the journey of faith of God's people in a broken world. And that's what the book of Lamentations is all about.
So the book of Lamentations is not a particularly uplifting book. It's not really a book that we can go to and be like, oh, there's so many great things that we have to look forward to in human life. There's all these great things about life. It's a lot of death, it's a lot of hurt, it's a lot of pain. But it has a place in the Bible, and it has a place of importance. We know from 2 Timothy that all scripture is good for teaching and reproof. So the poems of lament found here must be good for those uses. There has to be something that we can learn, some way that we can get reproof out of them, something that we can get out of them that will actually affect our lives for the good. And not only do the poems here reflect on how and why Judah fell, that's an important thing to note, but they also provide us a way of seeing how we can look at lament, how we should reach out to God in times of distress, how we should reach out to God when we're hurting, when we're in pain. They provide us a glimpse into what that looks like. The author here is anonymous. Tradition often describes the author here as Jeremiah. The author here providing us a way of seeing how we should respond to God in times of hurt and times of pain. So looking at Lamentations, I found some things that we really should remember when we're really hurting, the ways that we should approach God. And I don't really have an exhaustive list this morning of this checklist of all the things that we have to do when we're hurting. God, I have this, and this that I need to do, so I'm going to list this off to you. But these are just some things that I found, some interesting points that I found when going through Lamentations about what we should do when we're lamenting, and that we should lament. So the very first big point, before we get into anything about what we should do when we lament, is that we should lament. That we shouldn't be giving silence to God when we're in times of distress, when we're in times of hurt. In difficult times, there's always a straw of feeling like God is distant from us, so we don't communicate with God, we don't get in His Word, we don't pray, we kind of feel distant from God. That's something that I feel a lot of us have gone through, where when things are difficult, when there's a lot of pain, when it's like nothing's going right, God, where are you? We kind of feel like we're distanced from God, we don't want to go to Him, we feel kind of this hurt, we almost feel this sense of betrayal, and that's a really, really difficult thing for us to deal with. But we have to come to this realization that we are distancing ourselves from God. God is not distant from us. And that is what lament is all about, that we're not distant from God, that we still have this way to reach out to God. Cutting off communication from God limits our own ability to receive healing from Him. It limits our own ability to be in His Word, see what it is that He wants for our lives. And how are we supposed to learn from all this if we don't listen to Him, if we don't get in His Word, if we don't listen to Him through prayer, if we don't lament to Him? How are we supposed to receive healing from Him? We look at kind of an example of this cutting ourselves off from God, feeling betrayed, and just kind of feeling distant from the very first sin with Adam and Eve. They learn about evil, they sin, they learn about evil, and what do? They go in hiding. They try to hide from God. They try to distance themselves from God. They just don't feel connected to God. They try to hide. And God comes to them. God reaches out to them. In this time of evil, they run away from God. They don't want to come in communication with Him. They try to hide themselves from Him. And that's something that we ourselves have to learn not to do when we're in times of when there's a lot of evil around us. Just as Adam and Eve, when they discovered evil for the first time, sometimes we're similar in that when we see evil things around us, we see evil and then we try to hide from God. And that's something that we shouldn't do. How do you think the residents of Judah felt after experiencing all the fear and evil from this siege? Just like Adam and Eve discovering evil for the first time, people of Judah are experiencing this evil that Judah has never gone through before. So just like here, the author is not silent toward God. Despite all this evil, despite all this fear, we should also not be silent to God during these times. Intercession prayer is good, where people pray for us. That can be a really powerful thing. But like Owen said last week, we should go right to the source. Go right to God with things ourselves. We can receive healing through intercession. We can receive healing from other people praying for us. But really the most effective way to receive healing from God is to go right to Him. So, without that in mind, now we know, okay, we should go to God. What does that actually look like in lament? What does it actually look like to go forward to God other than just, okay, God, I'm here? So, I looked at some things in Lamentations here. Looked through some things that we can talk about, things to remember when we're trying to lament, when we're trying to reach out to God. And one very big point that I found through this, one thing to remember then when we're lamenting to God, is that God does not respond to our bitterness and anger with His anger. When we're lamenting, we can be bitter, we can have this, we just feel betrayed, and we can lift that up to God. He can handle it. And that's because God's anger and our anger are really, really different things. Human anger is emotionally fueled, it's chaotic, it's whatever is happening around us at this time. Whereas God's anger is slow, and it's responding to evil, not just responding to whatever situation is going on at the time. If we look in Lamentations in chapter 4, from verses 11 to 13, we kind of get a picture of what God's anger looks like versus our anger. It says, "The Lord has given full vent to His wrath. He has poured out His fierce anger. He kindled fire in Zion that consumed her foundations. The kings of the earth did not believe, nor did any of the peoples of the world, that enemies and foes could enter the gates of Jerusalem. But it happened because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed within her the blood of the righteous." We see God's anger here comes from generations and generations of evil happening to His people, from the righteous getting persecuted. That's where God's anger comes into the plan. Human anger is just a response to the situations that are around us. It's just emotion, where God's anger is divine. Lament provides us with a way to communicate with God all the things making us angry. He already knows what's going on in our lives, but He loves to hear from us about everything going on in our life. What's the point of trying to hide from God all the anger that we have? He knows everything about our lives. We should keep that communication with Him. We should keep all the communication of all the things in our life that are making us angry, making us upset, making us frustrated. Because again, God can handle all of those things. He wants to hear from us all those things. There's no point to hide those things from God. So when we're lamenting, we have to be open about all the things that are making us angry. We shouldn't be hiding away. No, I don't really want to talk to God about this. I don't know if He'll really like me saying that or like me bringing that up. God wants to hear about everything going on in your life. And just like that, chapter 3 in Lamentations starts out with a lot of ways that the author feels almost betrayed by God. That all these things have happened to him because of the Lord. And that's here in the Bible. That's an author saying all these things here in the Bible that we can look on generations later and learn from. That we can talk about these things to God. All these things are presented in a format to God that we can see. Remembering the difference between just being angry and frustrated with God versus cursing God. Those are two very different things of, we can be open, we can be angry, we can be frustrated, we can say these things to God, but we don't curse God. We bring these things to Him in a way that He is open and willing to hear. We can look back in the history of the Bible, we can look at Job, how Job was open about his anger to the people around him. But the whole point of Job, that despite all of this, despite all the bad advice given throughout that book, Job never cursed God. And we can be the same way in our lament. We can talk about all these things that are angry, we can talk about all these things in frustration, but we should avoid cursing God. We should avoid talking about how Owen talked about a few weeks back of sometimes when we feel angry at God, where a lot of people turn to atheism, where they don't really not believe in God, they just are angry at God, and that's why they're an atheist. That's an important distinction here that we've learned throughout the Bible, that we learn through this lament, where we can be angry with God, but that through lament should be drawing us closer to Him. Another point of talking about all these things with lament is that God is open and willing to hearing all of our questions. We kind of sometimes have this mindset of we should never question God. He knows everything, so why should we question Him about anything? But that's not really true, and we see that here in lament, that even in the final closing of lament, in the final poem, it's asked, why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us so long? That might sound a little familiar. My God, why have you forsaken me? Talking about Psalm 22 that we talked about a few weeks back, talking about Jesus saying it on the cross, of asking this question to God. We're asking God a question of, why have you forsaken us? It's not necessarily that He has forsaken us, but we have this question of, this is what it feels like, God. Why? Why does it feel like this? We have this opportunity where we can go to God and we can ask Him questions, whether they're rhetorical, whether we're really looking for an answer or not. We can ask God whatever questions that we have on our mind when we're lamenting. It's okay to question God when we see this. We might not get an answer right away. I mean, we talk about here of, they're in this time of siege, they're in this time of evil, and they're asking for God to restore them. Well, that's a really long process that doesn't happen right away. Even Jesus on the cross asking God, why am I forsaken? My God, for God, why have you forsaken me? He wasn't resurrected until 3 days later. That's not a quick, immediate turnaround. We see God answering these questions, but not right away, sometimes not in the way that we expect, not the way that we want. But we ask God all these questions, expecting that we might not get the answer that we want, we might not get the answer right away, but He will answer us. It might not be a way that's necessarily pleasant, or a way that we, in our own minds necessarily want. But we can ask all these questions when we're in a time of lament. Just like that, we shouldn't be silent to God. When we're in a time of lament, we should be open with all the questions on our mind, knowing that God has all the answers, and that we're not supposed to be sitting here trying to figure everything out ourselves, but we should be open and communicating with Him. It really shows through Lamentations here that asking God questions and having requests for Him go hand in hand. After these couple of questions at the end of the lament, the author says, "Restore to us yourself, Lord, that we may return." Immediately after asking these questions, there's a time of kind of bringing these requests to God, of, God, I have these questions, and these are some requests that I have. We can combine those things together when we're lamenting. We shouldn't be going forward to God expecting, God, I don't really have anything to ask you right now, I'm just really frustrated with you. We should ask those frustrations to God. We should ask questions to God, and we should also be giving to God our requests. All of these things come together in lament, and that's really important for us to remember when we're in a time of lament. Instead of just remaining in our bitterness and remaining in our anger, we can ask questions and we can give requests to God that kind of shift us away from that just settling in our bitterness and anger. And there's another thing when we're looking at Lamentations, another big point that I found when reading through this book of all these poems is that they are poems. That despite all this anger and evil and bitterness and frustration, that there's this organization of things brought to God, of the author bringing all the thoughts in an organized way to God, in an organized format. And not just in an organized format, but in a creative format in poems, each starting with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And just as the Psalms contain many poems of lament, there's poems here. They're human artistic expression to God. In a time of a lot of anger and a lot of evil and a lot of frustration, the author is sitting here and creating something organized and artistic and just expressing to God through the Spirit, through gifts that God has given to the author. Just like we worship, just like we sing, like we create songs, like we create artwork. We see here creating poems about hurt. We see poems about creating lament. And we can look at that and we can see ourselves when we're in a time of evil, just a lot of time of hurt. When we lament to God, we can bring these organized things together in a way. We can show this as an artistic expression to God. For those of you that enjoy poetry, I know myself not so good at it, but for those of you that enjoy writing, enjoy poetry, this is a valid way to approach God. You can approach God in a way that you're showing God all of the appreciation you have of the gifts He's given you, even in this time of just a lot of hurt and a lot of evil around you. I know personally, last year I went to the Milwaukee Urban Program, and I know some people here went to it this year. And in that time, we're only in Milwaukee a short time, but kind of experiencing a lot of the hurt and a lot of brokenness there. We enter into a time of lament. And what we kind of experience there is that, okay, we've experienced all these things, we've experienced all this hurt. Now can we organize this in a way of really bring this to God? Can we talk to God in a way like we do sometimes in prayer or sometimes through song, where we just have these things that we see, and can we organize this in a creative way where we're expressing our own creativity to God, because God delights in that. Just like God delights in us approaching Him at all, God delights in us approaching Him through the gifts that He's given us. That gives God so much joy, and that can give us so much joy in being able to do that. And one more thing that I noticed when going through Lamentations is that keeping an open communication in God reminds us of the hope that we have in Him. So reading through all Lamentations, there's not a whole lot of hope necessarily in the book. There's a lot of evil, there's a lot of frustration, but all of a sudden in the middle of the book we get this glimmer of hope. Now, why is this glimmer of hope even here? Why in the middle of all this evil and frustration do we have a hope? Well, the author here is being close to God, he's being connected to God, and being reminded of everything that God does reminds of that hope that God provides. Halfway through Lamentations chapter 3, from verses 22 to about 33, we see this big glimmer of hope, being reminded how God's mercies are new every morning. When we're in a time of distress and we're in a time of hurt, it can often be difficult to be reminded of God's hope. But being able to vent all these frustrations to God gives us an opportunity to actually be able to remember the hope that we have. Whenever we come to God, He hears us. And that's said over and over again throughout the Bible. Committing to being in His presence can really help us be reminded of the hope that we have in Him. We're reminded of all the ways that He already has worked when we come to Him saying, oh, these are the things going on in my life right now. Bringing up that hope in our lament is very important. Not only are we venting all these frustrations to God, we're venting all these things that are just evil in our lives. We're talking to God saying, God, I still have hope in you. And that's something that we have to remember in a time of lament. Just like before I said, not being stuck in bitterness or anger. In the middle of all this bitterness and anger, there's still hope that's presented. We can thank God for all the hope that we have in Him, even in the middle of all of our suffering. Even in the middle of all the things that are going on in our lives right now that we don't necessarily like, all the things that are really evil around us, we can come to God in a way that's thanking Him. And that's something that's often very difficult when we're in a time of hurt, when we almost feel betrayed by God, of coming to Him in thanks. But we can do that here by staying close to Him through lament, by venting all those things to Him. So, going through all these things, we've got things to remember when entering into a time of lament. A lot of things, when we come into a time of lament, not having to do every little thing here and there, we've got some important themes to remember when we're going through a time of evil, when we want to lament to God. First and foremost, that we should lament when we're in a time of evil, that we shouldn't be silent to God, but we should be open to Him with anything that's going on in our lives. Like I said, He already knows what's going on in our lives. There's no point in trying to hide from Him. When we do lament to God, we should be open about our frustrations. We shouldn't try to hide the things that are making us angry or hide the things that are making us bitter. God can handle whatever we bring to Him as long as we're willing to hear Him. We could ask questions, even if they're rhetorical, even if we know that there's not going to be a response right away, that we should be asking these questions of God. He can answer them. He's not necessarily going to answer them in the way that we want, but God does answer all of our questions. Also, lament provides us with an opportunity to worship God through creativity, just like writing songs, so many other ways, like creating art. It's just another way to be creative to God, of writing these poems of lament. And lamenting and staying close to God provides us with a way of being reminded of all the hope that we have in Him, being reminded of every single way that God has already worked in the past, that being in this mindset of being close to God reminds us of the hope that we always have in Him. So all these things kind of together, they're all important on their own. But what's a big takeaway that we can get from all of these things? Well, what about the next time that you're in a really distressful situation, when you're in a lot of hurt, when there's a lot of pain around you? I don't want us today to let's take a break and let's everyone write some poems of lament, because I know some of you aren't necessarily in a time where there's a lot of evil or hurt around you. Some of you might be at a really good point in your life and there's not a whole lot going bad. And it's not really worth trying to force some writing a lament when it's not really valid or it doesn't feel genuine to you. But maybe you are in a time of lament right now, or in a time where you should be in lament, where there's a lot of hurt or a lot of evil around you. The whole point of reading through Lamentations, we see so much of the things that have caused you to come in a downfall, and a lot of ways that we can learn from that, but we can also learn the ways that we ourselves should go about lament. And so the next time you're in a situation where you're just in a lot of hurt, or there's a lot of people around you, think about your next response to that. Are you going to be silent about it? Or are you just going to try to get on with your life yourself? Or are you going to come to God and ask God, help, honestly. God, these are the evil things around me, God. What are you doing right now, God? And where are you? Because He can answer that question, and we have that hope in Him. So instead of trying to organize today, like, okay, everyone grab a notepad, let's everyone start writing some kind of lament. What I want all of us to take away from here today is that just being reminded in the back of your head when things are really difficult, when things hurt a lot, the first thing you should do is lament about them. It might not be your first response now already, but that going to the future, that when you're in a really difficult time, to lament to God first. Other things can come later, you can try on your own later, but come to God first. Remember some of these things to try. Try writing in a poem, try asking a lot of questions, just try being hopeful in the middle of everything. Try to organize yourself into a posture of lament. It might be a challenge starting out, often, especially in the American mindset, we can do everything ourselves, but no, we should be going to God with those things.